investors and even consumers. And what is complicating the matter even further is the center versus the state tussle and the ambiguity on what is legal, right? So therefore, the industry actually has been in conversation with the government for many years to try and sort of create some regulatory framework. And with the latest amendments that the ministry has proposed to the IT rules, the government has taken a step in that direction. Obviously, there have been these conversations that there needs to be a separate legislation and we shouldn't be doing it through the IT rules, but that's a separate discussion. And so these amendments have led to a lot of chatter. There have been questions about their efficacy. There have also been questions about what it means for the online gaming industry. And the goal of today's panel is essentially to unpack these amendments and try to understand, the implications that it has in store for us. So, and that's the goal. And the government is actually taking comments till the 17th of January. I know a lot of people here are hoping for an extension. We might get one, but if we don't, then we hope that, these discussions that we are having feed into some of the recommendations that the government is thinking about. So to discuss the rules, I am joined here by a very stellar panel. Let me quickly introduce them. First, Shahana Chatterjee, who is a partner at Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas. Saloni, who is actually joining us online. She is the founding partner at Lumikai Fund, an interactive media and gaming focused fund specifically. Then we have Zara on my right. She's a gamer with several years of experience in esports and video gaming and is also representing the Esports Players Welfare Association. And Rutuja, who is the government affairs lead at Ikigai. And finally, Dhruv, the tech policy advisor at AIGF, also a partner in crime for this panel. So thank you everyone for taking the time to be here. Let me actually start the discussion. I wanted to split our discussion into three parts. In the first section, I wanted to essentially cover the overall regulatory framework that is being proposed and what is the kind of approach that has been adopted. So Shahana, if I may turn to you, can you give us some insight into what is the thinking behind these amendments and the broad view of what they're trying to achieve? Is there clarity on the different kinds of game formats that will get covered?
So let me start with your first question, Rohit. And before that, thank you so much for organizing this event. I think, of course, a very timely event and also, fantastic panel. I think you'll get some really interesting perspectives. Let me start with your first question. I think the idea with these amendments have been a long time coming, right? I think there's been a lot of engagement between industry and government about coming up with some sort of framework to give regulatory clarity. There has been an escalation of that engagement after we've seen a couple of these unfortunate orders from the GST authorities. And again, based on a lack of clarity on, what ultimately is a game of skill, what ultimately is a game of chance. And that discussion itself is so wrought with issues of center and state division, how some of the states are regulating, online betting and gambling, etc. And I think this was an attempt by the government to try and work out a middle path without going into conversations of ultimately, center state issues. And without ultimately going into discussions of defining what is a game of skill. Or rather what is not a game of chance. And so the idea was to create something of a regulatory framework. There was a lot of back and forth within the government and across the industry about who would be the nodal ministry, who would be the entity within the government who would take charge of this. And it's very interesting that it landed with MeitY because they're really approaching this from an intermediary perspective, right? And so you see a lot of the focus of the amendments is really on the platform and what the platform has to do rather than on what the gamers or what the developers have to do. And so I think it's an outcome of what I believe has been an industry ask, that there has to be some sort of regulatory clarity and an outcome of an understanding across the government that this is really the neater way to come up with the regulatory framework without stepping on toes of where the state may have powers or where judicial pronouncements would have to be relied on to determine what is a game ultimately. So I think that has been the impetus. And I think one of the overarching concerns that the government has had with some of the formats of games, of course, have been the kind of financial risk it has created. We've seen, for example, an increase in law enforcement access requests for what are now known as OGIs, relating to financial fraud investigations. And there's been a sharp increase in those sorts of LEA requests. And so that is again a concern that we've seen reflected in the amendments. And there has been this underlying concern with some of the other formats of games about what sort of addiction risk it can create, especially amongst children. So, I think it's a culmination of a couple of these concerns that the government has had as well.
And what about the different game format? Is there clarity on what's covered?
Loaded question. See, I think obviously, if you look at the definition, the attempt is to try and include as many formats as is possible. They have made the definition deliberately fairly wide, right? And on an online game is anywhere where there is a deposit, where there is a winning that is given to a user, etc. Now, if you start breaking this up across certain formats of games, I think for real money gaming, it's, for example, it's a clearer inclusion in an application. I think the more you move towards, say, tournament-based games, or where you move towards esports, you can try and argue for some of those formats that perhaps it is not really applicable because, as a user, I'm not really making a deposit to participate in the game. I may be making a payment as, an in-app purchase for certain features that will enable me to perform better within the game. I think there are some of those arguments to be made, but I think taking a step back from a strategic point of view, I'm not sure what the outcome of that would be, right? I think there is this regulatory framework that is now being offered. It will help to a certain extent, give comfort both to the users and to the government that, you are a platform that is subject to this regulatory framework, that you are subject to these norms and regulations that these SRBs are going to put in place, which is going to address everything from harm to children to financial risk, etc. And that helps kind of reduce a little bit of the regulatory uncertainty that gets created. And I think Saloni can speak to this more in terms of how this has really created challenges for investments that are coming into this sector. Because investors, especially foreign investors, are finding it very hard to grapple with the very nuanced issues that this sector throws up about, not just is this a question of, we have to resolve whether this is a game of skill or chance. How do we get certainty about that issue? What are the sorts of, indemnities? What are the sorts of reps and conditions that we need to put into our investment documents to make sure that we are safeguarded against this risk? So it created a huge amount of ambiguity. So ultimately, perhaps for certain formats, you could make an argument that it doesn't really neatly apply, but I'm not sure whether that's an argument we'd want to take.
Okay, great. No, that helps. And I think let me call on Rutuja to actually build on that. And also, given what, Shahana just said about the fact that there's lack of clarity possibly on some of the game formats that might be covered, to what extent will these rules, sort of plug the legal vacuum, so to speak, where will there still be formats that are sort of not covered? Will those guys have to do advocacy again? So the uncertainty may continue. And then also, do they diminish the roles of the states? I know that Shahana spoke about it a little bit, but it'll be good to understand that what will be the interplay between the central rules and state laws. And does it also mean that that question on what is a game of skill, game of chance, all of it continues as it was?
Thanks. Hi. It's okay. Okay. Hi, guys. Good morning. Thanks, Rohit, for the questions and for inviting me here. I think all fair questions, but I think in terms of what these rules are trying to address, they don't want to get into the conversation of formats, but it's more on legitimizing what the industry and responsible gamers have been trying to do in this space. In a way, they are recognizing that this industry exists and what they're doing is legitimate. And the rules prescribe from a larger perspective, they're ensuring that there is due diligence, there is the responsible gameplay, user harm is addressed, and there's accountability between the stakeholders of this industry. That's what these rules are trying to address. They're not overstepping in the sense on a state's authority or its ability to be able to legislate on gambling and betting. That is still with the states, right, under the constitutional the lists. So from that perspective, they don't get into the state, the skill versus chance debate at all. It's about whether here are XYZ lists of due diligence you have to do, and what do you do under them, and how do you go about executing it. And I think in terms of just how the rules go about, addressing bad actors, the rules are also giving the government some authority to identify the bad actors and call upon them under Section 69A of the Act, of the IT Act. And to that extent, the rules also give the government a certain amount of teeth in calling out the bad actors. But at the same time, it doesn't overstep on the state saying, we will be the ones regulating what can potentially mean online gambling or betting.
And I'll actually subsequently come on to this question later, Zara, to you, but the esports thing, will that vacuum still continue?
I think that still goes back into the conversation of the format, right? This is still, and like Sana said, it's online game, and the definition is purposely wide for a reason, so that anything which is offering a gaming format gets covered by these games.
So that'll get covered.
Correct. And the second item that I also wanted to add was they have a new clause in the draft rules. I think it's 6A, which says that if there is another kind of format that the government thinks needs cognizance of, they will be able to add it into the rules.
Which is something they've had in the IT rules across the board, that they can separately identify and add it. Okay. Okay. No, thank you. That helps. Let me actually go to Saloni. Shubham, if you can sort of take her online. Saloni, the question I had for you is building on what Shahana had also said, that the online gaming industry has grown rapidly over the past few years. But many say, and I wanted to hear your perspective, that regulatory confusion has, made investors somewhat jittery. So what is your perspective, and what have been experiences of some startups, for instance, that you've invested in, and what are the kind of things you've been considering as you look at investments?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, and my apologies that I'm on video. Look, I think first and foremost, when a lot of the narrative and noise in India around gaming has largely centered around real money gaming or cash gaming, right? And if you were to take a step back, gaming is much broader, much wider, much deeper than what we perceive than it to be just RMG, right? A lot of people mistakenly think that RMG is about 80-90% of the market in terms of just revenue size. And actually, data will show you that's not correct. There is a very large and broad ecosystem of gaming, whether it's content, whether it's platforms, whether it's tool tech infrastructure, which essentially exists in the Indian ecosystem at the moment. And as a fund, the way we look at the sector has been through a much broader lens than what is often commented and debated about. Now, from our perspective, I think we are very bullish, and we remain very bullish on gaming because a large number of macro factors and macro indicators and on-ground inflection points have led the gaming industry to a point where it is. Now, with respect to RMG gaming and investor sentiment around it, I think there are two camps of investors, right? The first camp of investor who has felt that it is better to ask for forgiveness rather than permission, and you set up these companies and you essentially build, and eventually regulation will catch up. And then there are another set of investors who essentially steered away from RMG at a point of time where there wasn't enough regulatory clarity, or they felt that there were certain regulatory gaps or lacunae. As a fund, Lumika has kind of been on the latter camp. We're by far India's most active games and interactive media investor, and we haven't had any RMG bets in the portfolio. Now that may change given the current regulation and us getting comfort from that. Now, in the former camp, there have been many investors who've taken those bets and who have seen their companies become exceedingly successful. And sometimes that kind of an approach of, we're going to build these companies and eventually regulation will catch up, do work out. Sometimes it doesn't. If we see, for example, what's happened in crypto, regulation did not catch up. In fact, regulation actually went the complete other way, where there was extreme taxation, and now you've got a lot of foreign investors stuck in Indian bourses who are concerned about what the exit horizon for those companies are. And a lot of those companies, particularly the crypto companies, haven't been able to achieve scale, and a lot of the co-founding teams, etc., have split. Now, I guess coming back to more RMG-centric regulation, the way we have also looked at the so one is, you know, the intent and the spirit of the regulation and legislation, and then second is what is the semantics and the wording of the regulation per se in the policy proposed, right? To us, there is a very clear intent towards regulating and providing some kind of framework for cash gaming. There is very clear indication about users putting and depositing money and in return receiving winnings in cash and in kind. That's specifically been called out. So to us, that is a very clear indication of the government's intent to kind of provide some framework for real money gaming, which I believe is the right way to go about it. You know, there has been a lot of regulatory gaps, and currently the running of real money gaming, there has often been an existential threat of, you know, is RMG allowed? Is it not allowed? And if it is not allowed, then what happens? So in the absence of, you know, the government taking away that existential threat, I think there is a very clear resolve of legitimizing the industry. I believe somebody in the panel said it's an attempt towards legitimizing the industry, also to provide some kind of a safer framework for these companies to operate. And the third is to provide clarity in the event what happens when there have to be exits, right? A lot of investors who've invested in RMG companies, often the question is, well, what happens? Are these companies going to be able to be sold to, let's say, to strategics or companies who want to buy these companies, or is there possibility of a listing? Both of these are only possible in the event of a regulatory framework, right? So when a company is, at least from the outside in, looking to buy assets, now RMG starts to become a part of that conversation, simply because, well, now there is a framework within which it can operate within this landscape. So overall, from an investor perspective, investor sentiment perspective, this is, I'd say, a very positive move to try and provide a system, or at least a framework for it to for this industry to exist. More, but if we were to go down in nuance, I believe the center state lacunae and that dichotomy between the state saying we're going to ban some RMG assets and the center saying, well, there's a framework provided within which these RMG assets can exist, is still, I believe, confusing. And I'm hoping that these discussions feed back to the government and there can be resolution around that.
Great. Thank you so much, Saloni, for adding that perspective. Now, actually coming to Zara as the gamer on the panel, your perspective of because what I understand is that last year when consultations were happening, there was a concern raised by the gaming community and parents and others that we also need to systematically look at gamers' rights and their what are the kind of problems they face. And I think in this rules, an attempt has been made to do something in that direction. So my first question to you is that what has been your experience with gaming intermediaries? What are typically the kinds of issues that are faced by gamers, and do these rules help address some of those concerns? And I think it'll also be good if you can talk about, I remember the conversation we had that, the concerns vary by game formats to some extent. So it'll be good if you can talk about that.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name is Zara, and nice big question. I'm going to divide this into three parts. The first part, of course, being that, as I went through all these regulations, I realized that there's one major issue that nobody talks about, is the fact that how clearly does everybody understand the differences in formats? Because, there's one way of looking at it from the law perspective, and then there are gamers who are sitting there and playing these games every day, and these are actually real problems that they face. So dividing this very clearly, esports stands for electronic sports, is basically competitive gaming. Now, when we say competitive gaming, it means a skill-based sport. So any game that's played on a competitive title, it could also be Candy Crush, can be considered an esports title if they're making money out of it. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is the normal casual games, whether you take something as simple as chess and go put money in to register for a tournament where, tomorrow you'll make 150 rupees from it. That also is considered esports, even though it's not technically so high in advance on the skill of playing with a keyboard and mouse. It's still considered an esport title. Now, Ludo is considered a competitive game, but it's not considered an esport title because it's also considered a game of chance. Right? So there are lots of different kinds of things to keep in mind when you're looking at the rules, that for everybody, the problem varies. Real money gaming, also the problem varies. And when we look at the rules in specific, you'll notice that anywhere you deposit, so of course you deposit money in real money gaming, but you also do that for participating in tournaments abroad. You also do that to get a chance at, getting a slot at a South Asian tournament. So you cannot really just say it's one small little box where this rule will apply. Now, to start off with a simple example, like I have one of the people who are part of a welfare association. He's a chess player. He wanted to go ahead and play an international chess tournament. He put in money. He was from Tamil Nadu. And he couldn't take part in the tournament or take the cash money, even though he was the best at the tournament, only because it was in Tamil Nadu and it's banned over there to play the sport in that fashion, right? So that was a problem that really shocked us, because chess is not something where you need to define anything. Everybody knows what kind of game it is and the outcome that comes from the game. But because it's such a blanket rule, we got to fight both the battles, right? We got to understand that as soon as the regulations come in, how is it affecting children? How is it affecting adolescents? These are the people who are so digitally connected. They are the Gen Zs. They go onto a platform, they see Carom, they see Rummy, they see Ludo, they see so many different kinds of games. They may start off playing one game and get influenced by another game. It could lead to addiction. It could lead to different kinds of problems which they did not think that they would face, right? So there has to be some amount of regulation when it comes to the safety of the players. And if that is not there, then, it's very difficult to understand, is everybody just free to do whatever they want to do? And especially for women also, you go onto sites, you'll be just playing a game, someone will send you a weird thing on your chat. There's nobody to really explain why this person could do this, or there could be also a simple link to hack your account and go ahead and take your credit card details and so on and so forth. And we've heard this not only through young gamers, but even elder gamers. Even women who play Candy Crush, for example, have come and complained that they were trying to buy something online for the game and their account got hacked. So it's a very big framework. Everybody is a part of it, and every angle needs to be seen to while dealing with this. And I think that answers most of your question. Okay.
No, that really helped. I think that perspective is important to keep, especially, for instance, the gender lens also that comes in when you are looking at some of these issues. I'll come on more details on grievance in my next part to you. But Dhruv, if I can come to you, your take on behalf of the industry, what are your thoughts? As I see it, registration of games and oversight by the self-regulatory bodies is the main approach that these rules adopt. There have also been questions on, is this delegating too much? Is this delegating too little? And also one question I wanted to ask is, will this approach, like the registration approach, fix issues like accountability and, fraud, etc., by offshore betting and gambling sites, and stuff like that?
Thanks, Rohit, for firstly organizing this event at such a short notice. Before answering your questions, I'll just take back to few of the things that were said. First point, I definitely want to get into the formats of the game that we were discussing. So how I see it personally, correct? What we think in India right now, constitutionally, there's a binary sort of dichotomy between, games. One is the game of chance, game of skill, correct? The courts, how at least for a few of the high courts that I've seen, is that they say that entry 34 of the state list under the Constitution of India, you have betting and gambling. Betting and gambling, the courts have said, has to do only with game of chance and not game of skill. So what these rules are basically, if you read the rules, it says that if an SRO is registering a game, correct, that game should not fall under the purview of betting and gambling laws of the country, correct? It should not fall afoul of those betting and gambling laws. So how I am reading it is that the game cannot be betting and gambling, so it cannot be a game of chance. And the definition is such, which is basically defining an RMG, a real money game, correct? Now, RMG can be of either chance or skill. Since it cannot be chance, it has to be skill. Correct? Obviously, the government has not gotten into how to define it, how to decide it, but that's the principle they are following. A real money game, which is not a game of chance or which is not betting and gambling, can only be registered in the game. That's how I am reading the format. Another thing that we talked about is formats, correct? Like which game do you recognize as something or not? Like, for example, a very interesting example that I took was Ludo, correct? Classic game of Ludo, most of the people believe it's a game of chance. However, what you will see is Indians being as innovative as they are, you will see a lot of formats of Ludo being changed, correct? And adding more skill elements, correct? You remove the chance elements and you make it more skill based. And then you can convert that format into a skill game, correct? Which has been done by a certain companies already. So the thing is, we can't even tag certain game as skill and chance at the moment. So we definitely need more clarity because there are ways to decide it. There are statistical ways to decide whether there's a skill or not. There obviously the Supreme Court has laid out certain subjective elements as to what is skill and not. So those can be applied. I think the burden might fall on the SRO and the industry to sort of develop that framework. As I think that's the expectation that the government has. Correct. Now coming to the esport, it's a very interesting thing Zara said, correct? Because all online games can be played under any kind of format. It can be played as an RNG, it can be played as esport, it can be played as esport in a multi-sport event, correct? It can be played free to play also in a freemium also. Same game can be played in any format, you just need to change the interaction with the game, correct? And that's why if you look at before the rules came, the allocation of business rules were amended. Online game was given to MeitY as nodal ministry. However, esports as part of multi-sport event is under the sports ministry, correct? So what we have to see is that sports ministry will definitely come up with some regulation or some way to deal with esports as a part of multi-sport event, correct? So maybe if let's say your OVS, the Olympic Virtual Series or the Commonwealth Games, on those aspects, the ministry will definitely come. But as Zahra's point, the esport where it is not part of multi-sport event, but also not a plain platform thing, that we have to see how that will play out. So these are the few points as to what I gathered from the discussion. Going to the accountability part
I
of
know
it.
lots of sub questions I asked together, but basically, yeah, that'll be great.
Yeah. So in terms of, I think how we have to see is how at least the industry is looking at it. That the ministry has told us very clearly, user protection, safety, and due diligence standards is the paramount concern. Within that framework, you innovate. It is on you to make sure that your framework is robust enough. If it is robust enough, we will give you space to innovate, correct? You develop your framework. For example, All India Gaming Federation already has a charter which has almost all the elements that you'll find in the rules, correct? So it's upon you to decide how robust you want that framework to be and regulate. One of the problems, I'll give you an example, before these rules came, correct? For example, AIGF have about 90 to 100 members in RMG field. Most of them were following the charter. It is a voluntary association, but there were some people say there are about 800 gaming companies in the country, correct? What about the other 700 people, correct? They might not be following any standardized user protection guidelines or any standard in that way, correct? They might not be having a random number generator certificate. They might not having a no-bot certificate. But now all those 800, 700 companies who are in this space have to necessarily follow these standards. So we're looking in that perspective, user protection first, within that innovate, and the burden is on you. If it doesn't work, the government can very well come up and amend, correct? And we have seen how they deal with the intermediary guidelines also, that something doesn't work, they are not shy of amending it and putting certain things in place, which will make the companies and the industry to sort of think as to what the next step should be. That's how we're looking at it.
No, that helps. Actually, let me build on that. And in continuing with the tradition of a multi-part question, Rutuja, I'm going to come to you. I think one part of the question that remains a little unanswered is that this. So I'm going to go a little bit more detail on the self-regulatory bodies and that approach and the registration element. Firstly, will it help with the the foreign betting and gambling issue that we face? Because one of the things that the government has been saying, there are a lot of sort of bad actors abroad who have been advertising and, people are falling prey to some of these things. Will the element of registration with SROs help address that? And do you think that's an effective way of doing it? That's my first part. And then I'll come to others.
Thanks, Rohit. So I think before that, I think just a little blue skies gazing, right? There was a long-standing ask from the industry to have soft touch regulation to govern this space. I think it's a sunrise sector, it merits that kind of regulation. From that sense, having an SRB framework is good because it gets the power back into the industry's hands and tells them to figure it out and regulate your space. it is giving the power back into the gaming associations, for instance, to weed out the bad actors from it. And it is so if somebody has to be registered and has to be able to offer its game, the way I see it is they will still have to go to the SRBs and get a registration done, have a certification on display on their platforms. And if the SRBs don't think they are falling within the contours of what just Dhruv said, right? It's an RMG offering a game of skill. If they don't have it, then they're not going to get certified, which means effectively they shouldn't be able to offer their services on their platforms. And in that sense, it to an extent definitely will be able to address that issue.
No, so that's a good point. But my other question to you would be that, as Dhruv said, the SRB has to take a decision. What is, I mean, isn't there a lot of subjective elements involved? What is legal, what is not legal? When the courts only have not been able to decide, and there's so much back and forth happening between the state government and the courts, etc., on what is legal, things get overturned. Is that giving too much subjectivity to SRBs, and can that lead to any kinds of challenges? Do you foresee that?
I think it's two things, and this is to Zara's point. So there are multiple formats, and Ludo can have 16 different formats, right? So there is nuance to how you want to certify even a game like Ludo. That is not something that you can regulate from a rules perspective. It has to go down to the nitty-gritties, and that is where the certification standards or the licensing framework that the SRB will come into play. Because it will be run by a set of industry folks, they will be able to have a better sense of how you want to certify a game and not certify a game. And that is the only way I think you should be able to do it. Whether there'll be subjectivity involved in it, yes. But it's too soon to say whether this is not going to work or work, because as we go forward and we see what kind of requests come into the SRBs for an approval for a certification, we'll know what kind of issues they face. And I think even the framework will evolve with time, because we also don't know so much that will come into their way, which we can't see at the moment.
Is the good thing that the rules give SRBs the place and the sort of room to sort of innovate, and even jurisdictional issues between states, etc., you are hoping will get resolved at the SRB level, or at least they'll figure out how to sort of allow something in one state and not allow in another?
So I'll answer in two parts. One, I think the state part I'll take first. The way I see it is the rules will apply simultaneously to the respective states' laws, right? They will not overstep that, in the sense, if an SRB is certifying, say, a game of chess, for instance, or rummy, and if it is not applicable in Tamil Nadu, then the SRB's job is to just register and certify it. But it's upon the gaming platform to not offer it in Tamil Nadu because it's banned there, but still be able to offer it in other states where it is, or a similar format is allowed in those states. That's how it will pan out. Just because it's banned in one state does not mean that the SRB has to not register it at all, because it's still a fragmented approach within the states. And I think in terms of the way I see the SRB framework, I think the hope is that it should give comfort to the states that, there are these formats and we think these are legitimate. And therefore, when you are coming up with your respective laws or amending the existing ones, please take a look at the way the SRBs are regulating the space, and they are framing they're looking at licensing these formats, and then take it from there. This, in a sense, should give them consistency in their thinking as the process would evolve.
Okay. No, that really makes sense. Actually, building on that, Shahana, I wanted to come to you. The deal is that there is an attempt to delegate some of that authority to SRBs, which obviously makes the system more agile. But also, the way I see it, do the rules foresee multiple SRBs? Can that lead to sort of regulatory shopping, and is that a good thing? So maybe there are multiple SRBs, you are not getting licensed by one, you go to another. And also, because there are so many subjective elements in certifying a game, like, one of the things, if I quote, it says the SRB has to look at the track record of offering online games responsibly before giving registration to an intermediary. Can this lead to very different kinds of things happening through different SRBs? And will that sort of unlevel the playing field, so to speak?
I wouldn't go as far as saying that it would unlevel the playing field. I think in the short term, we're certainly going to see a variety of methodologies being used, right? So the fact that the government is going to rely on the SRBs and ultimately hold the SRBs responsible for the manner in which they're going to grant registration is a huge responsibility. The rules certainly foresee more than one SRB, and that's very likely to happen in this ecosystem. I think we're going to see, at least a couple of SRBs come out. Each of these SRBs is very likely to have its own methodology in place, which will, on the basis of which they will grant registration, right? Now, I'm not a student of statistics, but I'm assuming that there would be variance between these methodologies. I think there will be some short-term challenges around, some sort of arbitrage that is created across these SRBs. And, OGI is trying to leverage forum shopping to go to the most, or use the methodology that they believe would be most advantageous for that particular format. But I think, again, like Dhruv said, neither the government nor I think the SRBs would hesitate from fixing those short-term problems. I see them really as very short-term kind of teething issues when you have a new ecosystem coming into place. But be that as it may, I think despite the difference in methodology, I think in the longer term, we are going to see a move towards a more institutionalized, certification type of a framework, where I think best practices will be borrowed. I think there will be, some sort of, I don't want to say uniformity, but perhaps a standardization of the methodologies that are followed. And I don't believe that it is going to create issues around, long-term issues around arbitrage, etc. I think there will be settling down of what certain SRBs are going to follow. We might even see certain SRBs develop around certain formats of games. And so OGIs would go to that particular SRB for registration, etc. But I think what is interesting in the rules is that OGIs have no restriction from participating or going to multiple SRBs, right? And I think that's really important, especially for the smaller OGIs or for the startup OGIs, is that actually serves as an advantage for them, right? That they are able to do that forum shopping, that they're able to go to an SRB that perhaps is, more open to innovation in a format that they have created. Right. So I think it creates as many opportunities as it does challenges, which hopefully will be limited to the short term. But can I also just speak to your earlier point on the foreign gambling and betting? I think the issue there is, the challenge there is slightly different, right? Because I think there is clarity in the law. Like if you come to us as a lawyer and say, give us an opinion about whether these platforms are legal or not, they are not. The challenge is that they're still able to leverage the loopholes in Indian law and advertise on TV when IPL is going on, right? I'm still able to access those platforms sitting from India. And when I earn or when I win something, I'm not always able to bring those winnings back into my Indian bank account. So the challenges there, I think, are a little bit different. And I think this ecosystem that is going to get set up may address that to a certain extent, but those challenges are different. It's more about how do we ensure that those platforms are not being advertised over here? How do we ensure that how do we protect our Indian users from financial fraud that is happening on a platform which is essentially in the UK, for example? So I think those challenges are a little bit different.
No, that makes sense. And by virtue of registration, requiring registration, I think you would stop some of these. And I think there's also that element in the rules which says that before another intermediary can do advertising, it needs to check with the SRO of the registration status. And I am guessing that if it's, say, the Google Play Store, you will maybe have APIs eventually that ping an SRO database to check whether there is a registration before something is allowed, right? So, no, so that's a fair point. I'll actually go to Saloni now. And Saloni, just building on what, Shahana said about multiple SROs and, the SRO having, see, I think the difference is that in the case of, say, some other self-regulatory bodies that are envisaged in law, like the intermediaries, etc., here the SRB has the power to deny market entry because it needs to register you, right? So do you foresee any challenges for smaller players? And I ask this because even though the rules say that the SRB has to be independent at arm's length, is there a risk of capture bias? Because ultimately these are being set up by competitors, right? Even if you delay somebody's market entry, the incumbent can have a lot of advantage. And in fact, I was also told yesterday that you have to submit a lot of details to the SRB to get approval. Are you revealing certain IP in the process? And then can that have any implications? I think you're on mute, Shubham.
Sorry, yeah, I couldn't unmute myself. Yeah, I think that look, the SRB framework, on the face of it, is a positive development, and it gives, let's say, power back to the industry. But the devil's in the details, right? There are a couple of things that come up. One is, what will be the composition of the SRB? Now, the policy framework does attempt to define the composition and the participants of the SRB. But you're right. What if there's competition? If you're a new, let's say, incumbent aiming, new disruptor aiming to dethrone the incumbent, and you've got the incumbent sitting on the SRB, are they inclined to, let's say, not certify you, which then hence either delays your market entry or to some extent even stops it? So yeah, this is definitely a consideration. So I think the first challenge here is what is the composition of the SRB? In this way, the fact that you have multiple SRBs to some extent mitigates that risk. The second is obviously what happens in the case of, let's say, one SRB doesn't certify you and the other does. Does that stand? I presume there is no clarity in the framework, but the rationale of having multiple SRBs would to some extent provide that comfort. The third obviously is the applicability of the SRB in terms of just the ability of the company, the effort of going through the SRB process, right? Is there a possibility of maybe having a certain degree of a threshold? Maybe the threshold can be, once you're a certain size, once you've processed a certain amount of transaction volume, once you've hit a certain number of users, and hence at that point of time, the SRB becomes applicable. And our recommendation is that, if you are to, let's say, and regulation is always, needs to be balanced by the fact that you need to regulate an industry, but also not stifle innovation. Our recommendation is that why not have some kind of threshold beyond which a company needs to go and register with the SRB, and hence it kind of reduces the compliance burden, hence reduces the risk of at least, clamping down on innovation in that sense, is that once it reaches a certain size, then it, needs to go through the SRB and needs to have those frameworks. The threshold can be as low or as high as the government or the regulator determines, but perhaps that is one way of kind of mitigating many of these risks.
So, Saloni, just to ask you another question, following up on this. So in some areas of licensing regimes, there's this regime of general authorization, wherein you lay down certain principles and you say that this is what responsible conduct is supposed to be, and you don't stop anybody's market entry as long as they sort of work with the general authorization, and somebody can come and complain if you are not sort of doing it.
Right.
And then you register only later. My concern comes from the fact that the SRB actually has the power to stop you from entering, right? So would you prefer something like that? And also, I currently don't see in the rules and appeals process, except for the SRB shopping.
Yes.
There is nobody, you can't go somewhere and say that I've been wrongfully denied this.
Absolutely. So, and this is this is really a critical point. One is to lay down the conduct and the contours of, let's say, what responsible gaming looks like. What does user protection look like? What does KYC and due diligence norms looks like? And, then having every participant in the industry adhere to that. And the second is the certification, which essentially determines participation in that market, right? We're all for the former. In the form of the latter, we believe there needs to be some kind of threshold. The rules should not apply to every participant, whether it's an incumbent or whether it is a new market entrant, right? Because this will be a very, very big deterrent in at least promoting market entry. So, I completely agree. And I think that's potentially a recommendation because, for example, the AIGF does a great job in essentially providing a framework for operators to operate. Now, why not make that an open framework for all market participants to at least adhere to in terms of, good conduct and responsible gaming? But at the same time, when you have to go to the SRB level, the SRB for, let's say, certification, there is a certain threshold that gets implemented, whether it's in gross transaction value, whether it's volume of users, but there has to be some kind of mechanism which doesn't basically cause a deterrent for new market entrants.
No, thank you so much. That really helps. Dhruv, coming to you, any suggestions? And I mean, she also referenced AIGF, for instance. Any suggestions on how? One, what do you think of these suggestions, and how can we make the SRB model more robust? Are there any lessons from other approaches in India or potentially abroad where something similar has been tried?
Sure. Yeah. So Saloni's sort of recommendation is quite interesting in that sense that we think that there might be certain things which should be, or even in these rules also, certain compliances could be sort of taken up only after you have reached a particular threshold. Like for example, like a chief compliance officer, correct? In significant social media intermediaries needed, not everyone. Same thing could be done for this also. But in terms of, let's say, the certification process, so let's say it's registration process as the rules put it. I'll take your points one by one. First, something you talked about IP, correct? So I'll tell you my experience right now. So let's say under AIGF, if someone comes, they submit you a legal opinion, robust legal opinion, one or more, correct? So, and in that it enumerates the rules of the game, the gameplay, etc. That you can, if you play it, you'll know all that, correct? So it's already public information. You don't share your code, correct? No one, I don't think that any SRB will take that burden of asking you to give your algorithm to them, correct? So in that sense, concepts are not IP, ideas are not IP. So that way, in classical legal sense, I don't think any SRB will ask you to share your IP, correct? It is not happening right now, won't happen in future. So that's not a problem. But I agree that idea also, first movers advantage is there. So a solution could be that let the game be launched, have a 3-month or 4-month or 6-month period where they can go to the SRB and say, the game is running, we will supply you with data, we'll supply you with legal opinions, we'll supply you that we are in compliance. And in that time, you register the game, correct? If let's say there are problems, you let us know, and within those 3 months or 4 months, we'll change them, correct? We'll come to that. So what will happen is post-launch, so that the person doesn't have to worry that, oh, well, while I'm waiting for the registration, can someone else steal my idea and launch it, correct? That won't happen. So that will give that comfort. And anyway, in terms of IP, no one. So what maximum an SRB can ask? Your compliances, a legal opinions and analysis as to why it's not betting and gambling, correct? Maybe a statistical conclusion that more experienced player win more often, correct? That's a good way of statistically showing that, it's a most likely a game of skill, correct? All these things are not IP, so you don't need to worry about it. If it is post-launch, then you don't need to worry about that, oh, someone else can copy it. So that kind of a model can definitely work and takes care of these concerns. And as Saloni said, that maybe above a certain threshold, certain compliances can be applied to only those significant intermediaries. In terms of one more question, I think about offshore, I think you were interested in answering the offshore, and you have asked us a few times, and I'll tell you that we have been working directly with a few ministries and agencies to stop that. You must have seen now, you won't see on OTT platforms, streaming platforms, these offshore betting site ads are not coming, correct? And we can tell you that we have been going to the government, asking them to do this a lot, and there are proofs of that. There are still certain issues like influencer marketing and team sponsorship that are still there. I am assuming in few months you'll see that also. But if you want to know what these rules do for that, I'll give you an example. So when we go to the government or the influencers or teams that don't take these offshore guys, why are you doing this? It's illegal. They ask us, sir, how do we differentiate between a good game and a bad game? They don't care about scale chance. They don't care about that. Good and bad is what they understand, correct? How much cost will it take us to do that due diligence, correct? What these rules are doing, they are saying that you have to have a demonstrative mark on your game. So now that basket of, oh, this is fine, this is not fine, the cost of due diligence goes down for all these guys. So they can take that moral responsibility, and also maybe let's say the Ministry of Consumer Affairs or maybe in that sense can take from these things and in their guidelines can attach. That's fine. This is a sort of a regulation from MATI. You can take guidance from this and follow that. So that offshore betting and gambling thing, at least from the advertisement perspective, can be taken care of. The rest of the things in terms of whether blocking and all, I think MATI blocking in the financial models, the flow that they follow, that is a slightly more tricky conversation that we can have the next day.
No, that's a good point. And I'm sorry for so many sub parts to my question. It's a complicated issue. So, I'm trying to squeeze in as many as I can. But I also wanted to ask that in this space, and just a follow-up question to you, the main tool that the SRB has registration, but it doesn't have any other powers per se to penalize or anything, which none of the other usually self-regulatory bodies have. So do you think there needs to be something else also that they have, or will registration or the sort of, so to speak, the registration as a proxy for licensing do the trick?
So how I see it is that because there's a grievance redressal mechanism, at least in the rule, I'm assuming someone or the other will point it out. And once they point it out, it will first go to the company can sort of resolve it. If they don't, the SRO, it will come to SRO. And that's the time when the SRO can look into it properly, correct? And I think that's a good way of not giving too much power to the SRO.
But the deal is that what is it that the SRB can do, even if the company doesn't adhere to the direction that it has given? So let's say there is somebody who needs grievance redressal, complaints. It's not internally addressed at the company's level, comes to the SRB. SRB issues an order to the platform or the intermediary that do this. But the SRB doesn't have any power except for saying, I'll deregister you. So that's a high bar to put pressure, right? So what will happen then? If the intermediary doesn't comply, it'll go to GSE. So, and you think that that model is fine?
I mean, again, as Rutuja said, it's too early to see how it will pan out, but I'm assuming that most of the companies will know that it's in their self-interest until unless it's an existential issue to not blow it out of proportion that it's going to the GST. Correct?
Okay,
Like
got
look
it.
at the OTT model. Correct?
Got it.
I don't think so. The interministerial committee that they have on the third tier, I don't think so. They are getting any complaints to that level, correct? Because most of the complaints are taken care at the tier 2 only.
Okay.
And I think that's a good, as you were asking other models that are working. I think that's a good model to see that it might work. Also look at ESRB, correct? So how ESRB, the content rating system, the game rating system in US, correct? It's a fantastic model. It has been replicated across the world, PEGI and ESRB. And they are self-regulatory bodies. They sort of rate their games, age rate their games, and it is successful and it's being sort of copied by everyone. So I'm saying there are ways, because you have to understand, there are inbuilt checks and balances. The companies don't want to delegitimize their industry. The SRO doesn't want to sort of not deal with it properly. So everyone, it will check balance each other. Correct?
Correct.
I think it's a fair point that there is no grievance redressal or an appellate mechanism within the SRO framework, but there is a nuance in the rules where they say that the SROs have to submit a compliance report to the ministry, basis which the ministry can decide often whether they want to issue blocking orders or not. So there will be some sort of capturing of that data that this is a bad actor, this is not a responsible enough actor within that compliance report that the SRB will prepare. That could be a teeth that some sort of teeth the SRBs can have over its existing members.
Correct. Yes. Sorry, there's a question. There's a mic there, so you can pick that.
I think what's important with our kind of industry is, particularly since it's a sensitive industry, and I'm not saying sin industry, I'm saying sensitive industry, very deliberately, is not just to be kosher, but to be seen to be kosher. Yeah. And therefore, some of the suggestions that are being made for thresholds, etc., I think, one bad apple can give the industry a bad name. And therefore, and also to the point that, like the OTT industry, there is a consistency in the kind of people who are there. There are certain size, there's a uniformity among in the OTT industry. The various players, whether it's Netflix, etc., have a certain standard. Here, you're going to have a very diverse bunch of people. And therefore, I'm a little concerned about talking about thresholds, etc. I think we need to be seen to be kosher and be kosher, and therefore not allow some fly-by-night operators, etc., to come and muddy the waters and the image of the industry.
Fair. No, that's a good intervention. I have just one or two more questions from the panel, and then we'll sort of open it up to the audience. Zara, I wanted to come back to you on this grievance point also, that can you just help us understand from a gamer's perspective, what is the grievance process that's been laid out? Do you think that will work? And there is also this requirement of India-based officers, even from foreign gaming companies. Do you think those are the kinds of requirements that are needed to address some of the issues that gamers typically face? Or
yeah, so I was really happy when they said that there would be a grievance body that we could all talk to and explain things to, because when you look at again gaming, it's such a broad term, and I'll give you a very simple example to kind of tell you why this is so important. There was a time, I think about 3 years ago, where there was a game that came out. It was called the Blue Whale. Okay, And it was a crazy game. You saw, and when you say things to deposit to win, there people were doing tasks which were unbelievable, or things that you couldn't even imagine to achieve the goal of winning the game, right? So when you think of it very precisely, there are a lot of ways that games have been made to be addictive, right? To make you do something extra. And that problem comes when it's a game that is getting catered to kids and getting catered to the age group of, say, I would say 13 to 18, who really kind of don't know the difference between what's bad and good, right? And that's where age gating is required. For me, I believe the rules have to be very strict for that age group. So it has to be anybody below the age of 18 should have very strict rules put across. And if it's not done, then you're going to see even worse cases come out tomorrow, because there is no other body that will say that this game is just wrong. This is wrong. There is no need for a big discussion also about it. There are certain elements in games which only can be noticed by people who play games and understand the long-term problems that it could create. Apart from spending 8 hours, 9 hours playing, you're investing so much money into it. You're investing, your whole behavior changes, right? So my major concern when this was discussed was just that, when we talk about how strong the rule should be strong till the person is 18. If they are logging into a site, do we need KYC? I would say it should be. For kids who are logging into sites, what games they're playing, it should be monitored. We should be knowing what's happening, because tomorrow we are the ones who need to answer to the parents. If something goes wrong, they're going to come and say, but you guys said it was okay, right? Which is why these regulations are important. On a very basic level, talking about how it affects real money gaming and things like that, this is very positive, just to bring some amount of safety in the whole ecosystem. And it's not only kids, even adults. I don't think a lot of adults even understand the variety of titles in the industry. What are the long-term drawbacks of getting involved? Is it clearly mentioned when you log into a game that this could be addictive? Please be careful. Don't invest too much money while you're playing the game. This is, after all, an entertainment sector. So I think with the whole space of having these rules put into place for kids, making sure that there's safety for women in the industry, making sure that this is very clearly stated on websites, and even if there's still an issue for someone who's above the age of 18, there's a place they can go and discuss this. They could put out what happened, they can state their issues, and that can be then seen to by the SRO. I believe they are one of the people who can also say, okay, I think this can go ahead and be placed for a larger discussion.
That's a very valid point, and I think the Blue Whale example is a very good example to sort of put it into context. It had really sort of caught people by surprise, what was happening. So I think the rules do sort of lay some of these things, put responsibilities on SRPs, and that will help. If I can go to Saloni, and I just wanted to understand, though, still, is there a need for a little bit of risk-based compliance, this thing? So ideally, yes, that, we need to sort of protect users on the platform, and I completely agree with that. But can we do it in a risk-based way so that it doesn't overburden all intermediaries, especially the smaller players? So Saloni, my question to you is that, do you think that some of these compliances, especially say India-based officers, stuff like that, and multiple officers that are needed, there is even a rule for A1, which requires all intermediaries to respond to government requests in 24 hours. In the normal IT rules, this deadline is 72 hours for social media intermediaries as well. Do you think some of this will increase compliance or obligations, and would you rather have it graded?
Yeah, so, I think, all of these are really interesting challenges that are going to now face gaming RMG companies and some gaming companies, right? I think, one is, again, look at it from a larger perspective. I think these companies up until this date were battling an existential risk. So, which was, will the government one day wake up and at least, completely ban us? That to some extent has been taken away, and now these measures have been put in place. Now, to the extent to which these measures will put in place, the thresholds at which they will apply will all be debated and applied, and the policy will be fine-tuned. But I believe a lot of players already are now kind of adjusting to this new reality and believing that this is the cost of doing business. So, whether you, and a lot of some of the larger players already do have some of these measures in place, at least some of the larger players. Now, the smaller players, if they're looking to enter into this market, will start providing and provisioning for those, which I think is not a bad thing. Right. Having no bot certificates, doing KYC, etc. I think these are all very basic hygiene things which the industry should be doing anyways. Right. There have been far too many reports of, there have been these RMG platforms which have operated, which have taken user deposits, and those user deposits that have vanished. And, there have been people who've been unable to reclaim them back, and there has been no judicial recourse for them. So at least all of this, to some extent, controls that. I think also has to be a recognition of the fact that until and unless you respect your gamer, and until and unless you respect your user over a long period of time and you protect them, that's the only way to build a very healthy, sustainable company, right? So it takes out to some extent the short-termism that can often come in when people are building companies, especially when it's a high growth phase. So all of this kind of puts things a little bit into perspective. But that being said, there have to be a certain amount of I'd say certain amount of cognizance given to the size of operations and the size of a company's business before kind of burdening those companies with excessive compliance. And the operative word is excessive, right? And that obviously is to be determined. I know it can't be subjective because one company can feel it's excessive, the others may not. But to some extent, there needs to be some level of threshold, as we all know, there is precedence for it, right? In the social media norms, for example, there is precedence for a certain amount of threshold before under which certain rules and certain norms are applied on companies, and there are certain norms which are exempt. And that, I believe, makes it a fairer playing field, because at the end of the day, this is also about encouraging innovation. It's also about ease of doing business. And I believe that principle should also not be lost.
Thank you so much for that perspective. Shahana, I'm going to come back to you with one of the last questions here. And it's interesting that Saloni mentioned social media intermediaries. Now, Rule 4A also suggests that gaming companies may also be classified as social media intermediaries. So my question to you is that what kinds of gaming platforms may be classified like that, and what are the implications for that? And is there a need for content moderation on gaming platforms? Because social media, typically one of the reasons why social media, content moderation is needed, because information spreads faster to a larger number of people. You need to nip it in the bud. But gaming platforms are more closed in some way. So is there a need to treat them similarly?
Okay, let me start with the comparison to social media platforms. I think the way I read 4A being set up is that it is creating obligations on OGIs that are similar to the obligations that have been created for SSMIs, right? And it says that OGIs will have to comply with all of this in addition to your standard due diligence requirements, and in addition to whatever requirements apply for SSMIs to the extent that it is applicable. So I think what we're looking at is not the treatment of OGIs as SSMIs, but rather where SSMIs may offer certain games on their platform, they would also then have to consider the additional obligations as an OGI. Now, that being said, just to take a step back, I think the mechanism that we have seen being used across data governance frameworks, right? So be it the digital personal data bill or the cybersecurity norms, etc., is that the government has tried to create a higher threshold of obligations to the extent that you are of a certain size or that you're systemically important, etc. It has, and that's what we see with SSMIs, right? That if you are a intermediary, a simpliciter intermediary, a social media platform below that 50 lakh users, you have certain standard obligations. If you cross that threshold, you have additional obligations, right? So it's not, that's the consistency in approach that they have used, which is, yes, absolutely lacking as far as the OGI obligations are concerned. And I think, sir, to your point, there are arguments to be made on both sides, right? That yes, this is an industry that needs certain legitimacy. It is in the self-interest of a lot of the users to show that they're compliant with these very baseline requirements, right? And of course, on the other hand, it does create a compliance challenge for the smaller participants. And there are ways in which that can be dealt with. In the cybersecurity norms, we saw a delay of application of the rules for, startup companies, etc. So there are ways in which that can be dealt with. But I think overall, I also agree with Saloni that this is not a bad outcome. I think it creates clarity even for the SRBs, because that is one of the considerations that the SRBs has to take note of when admitting members, right? That what is your track record of having complied with your due diligence requirements? And if you have a baseline of what those due diligence requirements are, what those obligations are, makes it easier for the SRB to admit members. Makes it easier for the industry to say and address a lot of the risks that we know are concerns with the government, that we know are concerns with player associations of harm, financial fraud, etc. So I think ultimately, coming back to what Dhruv said, I think it is in self-interest. It does create that recognition and legitimacy. And it is, of course, a lot will come down to how it plays out in the future. There are very, very likely going to be massive challenges to, orders of the SRB to register a particular game or not register a particular game. That is, of course, going to happen. But I think overall, having these additional obligations apply to OGIs is not, to my mind, it's not the worst outcome.
Okay, great. Now, before I open it to the audience, any comments from anybody else? Anything else you would want to add? No? Good. Okay, great. So please feel free to ask questions if you have any. You can just raise your hand and, I'm happy to sort of call you. Yes, Burgess. I think there might be a mic there. And Deepu, can you just ask?
Hi, I'm Burgess. I work at ShareChat. Just a couple of questions. One, I think I didn't hear anyone asking why is it that a gaming company is an intermediary? I mean, where does that stop then? Will edtech companies become intermediaries? I mean, a gaming company at the end of the day, it's their game, their rules. We don't know what fraud is happening or not happening at the back end. The user is just putting money and playing, or just choosing the game, even if he's not putting money. So how are they actually an intermediary? That's number one. Number two is, how does the cost of compliance come down? Because you now have to pay this self-serving body of sorts, rather than just following the law which the government should set up. So how does the cost of compliance come down, right? The third is, this self-serving body is now deciding the rules, which will be set by the biggest players in the room. Rather than, there may be a smaller startup that actually comes out with a game that doesn't want to follow these rules that the largest player in the room has set up, right? Again, why should that be the case? And then the other part is things like appropriate measures for children. What are those appropriate measures? Will the largest company in the room decide what those appropriate measures are? And more importantly, I think at the end of it, what is the penalty for not following this? If I, as a startup, don't want to join these bodies and pay them 10, 15, 20 lakhs a month or a year or whatever else, what happens then? And even if I join this body and then I break the rules that this body that the largest startup in the space or the largest gaming company has set up, I break the rules, what then? Will the government put a financial penalty? Look, if you look at the privacy law, for instance, there is a set financial penalty. We can argue whether that's limited or that's too much, but what is that number? If there is no number, I can get away with, stealing information, misusing data, getting children addicted or whatever else, and then just pay like 5 crores and go away. So I think these are questions that should be asked, rather than just saying these rules are amazing and it brings, certainty. It actually brings a lot of uncertainty, because the rules are actually being set by the biggest players in the room, not by startups that actually want to innovate in this area. And where does this thing about intermediaries end then? Will edtech companies become intermediaries? Will everybody be an intermediary? We should be asking whether the government is actually giving away this power to these 2-3 bodies, which will be funded by the largest players, and everybody else has to suffer.
In going with the theme of the discussion, multi-part question. So who wants to take it? And Saloni, if you want to take something, just raise your hand, he'll unmute you. Yeah.
Sure.
I'll definitely take it. So firstly, uncertainty. I mean, whoever is active in this industry, be the small players or the large players, they know what is it like to be banned in a state and then running around. So I think in this industry, 99%, you might find that 1% of players. I think 99% will want this certificate for simple reason I told you. How do you differentiate between an offshore gambling site and a skill gaming platform in this country? Correct? Go to any advertisement agency, go to anyone, any influencer, they will ask you this question. Correct? They need to have the differentiation. If anyone has a better idea, I think the government will lap it up. They will take it and get it. Correct? If you're saying let's go to the High Court for each and every format, in last 60 years, only 3 formats or 4 formats have gotten discussion. Correct on this. Currently, there are more than 100, 200 formats. Correct? If you think High Court is the best place to go, great. But I think 99.9% of the industry want it. As to the question of children, I think an RMG game should not be allowed to people under the age of 18, and that's very clear, and that's what they're saying. There should be age gating, and I think all SRBs will mandate age gating going forward. Correct? So the children issue will be resolved. It's in the rule also. I don't think so there is an issue in that. So
No, all I'm saying is, why should this be by SMBs? The government should be putting these rules in, right? SMB is saying it, that means I have to pay 15 lakhs or 20 lakhs or whatever to join this SMB. It's not a free body, right? So why should I have to pay this, follow the rules that are set up in this SMB, by the way, by the biggest player in the industry? This is so for instance, and this is not about real money. This is just about gaming in general, right? It could be Blue Whale, it could be a real money game, it could be whatever else. My question is that why should I have to join a body? The question should, the clarity should be that the government puts in rules for every player, right? Rather than saying one SMB will create rules around this, another SMB will say, I don't want to be part of this. There will be multiple SMBs. So you may say you will have stricter rules. I may choose to create my own SMBs like some players have done, where I create my own SMB, my 10 companies become part of that SMB, and then we'll decide the rules. SMB is mine. I'm funding that. I'm funding the game. Everything is mine. And the government says, great. And more importantly, how can you have self-regulatory bodies governing something that is criminal in some states of India? I mean, if it is actually a crime in parts of India, and in other parts of India, you're saying, guys, just govern yourselves. It's all good. I mean, that's kind of silly.
Coming to the first criminal part, correct? And I think during this discussed that if it's criminal in one part of India, firstly, let's understand that a court can interpret what is skill or chance in a particular way, correct? And it can be overturned, correct? A state might bring a law which the High Court says is unconstitutional. That happened in Madras, that happened in Tamil Nadu, that happened in Karnataka, correct? So that's one thing. So criminality in this case is a very sort of a definitional issue. So you stop that game, and the rules are saying that you stop that game in that state, and in rest of the state where it was, let's say for Karnataka, Rummy, poker, etc., the game of skill, you run it because the court has said it. So that will happen. I think there's no doubt. In terms of why SMB, I think it is not going to reduce the cost of compliance. But as one gentleman has said, correct, that this industry is a sensitive industry and they need to invest in that cost, correct? Now, why do we, if you, let's say, startup, correct? If let's say 20 startups who do not have that money, they think that they can do it more efficiently. There is option of more than one SMB, correct? They will set up a more efficient SMB, go to the government and say, please let us run it. If it doesn't work out, the government can de-recognize SMB, correct? There is provision in the rules where you can be de-recognized. So I think that can be balanced depending if you can find an efficient.
Just to sort of add to that, the only issue that might there be that setting up a new SMB doing that will delay your market entry, which, and unfortunately in tech, for instance, the speed is of the essence in terms of market entry. But having said that, anyone else who wants to come into the question, especially the other question that he asked is that, will EdTech companies start getting regulated as intermediaries? From my understanding of it, this is a stopgap measure, as I understood, that, while the government plans a larger law, they thought that this is a framework they can pull it in. But, if anyone wants to come.
Not on the not on the EdTech part, but on just the one player running the SMB conversation, right? First, we came from a place where there was no regulation. It was just, it was uncertainty end to end. Now we are at a place where at least something is legitimized, something is recognized. That's a step in the right direction. And we'll take baby steps to go to a larger conversation for having a comprehensive law, which should ideally address a lot of the points that Charlie talked about. But in terms of the constitution of the SRB that the rules talk about, it does have a nominee from the government. It does have a diverse stakeholder representation in it. So there can be systems in place, checks and balances in place to ensure that it's not just one company having its five similar format players coming into the play, getting legitimized and going and operating their games. So I think to that extent, it will not be as black and white as we think it will be. Of course, I mean, it's a developing, it will evolve as time goes, and we'll have to see in what direction it goes. But I think the rules do prescribe certain checks and balances to an extent.
I can speak to the EdTech issue. EdTech platforms are intermediaries. They follow the due diligence requirements today that are prescribed under the rules. They are also going to be subject to a lot of the age gating requirements under the privacy law, for example. I think the reason we're seeing this call out of a separate category and these elevated obligations is because there is a perceived risk attached to this sector and to these platforms. And those are the risks that are, there's an attempt to mitigate those risks as far as users are concerned through these amendments. But I think a fundamental question on, who is an intermediary, would EdTech be an intermediary? Yes, and unfortunately, the category of intermediaries is very, very large, right? And the way the law is set up is that you, to the extent, have third-party content on your platform, it is in your interest to follow those due diligence requirements so that you can avail of those safe harbors, right? So the bottom line is that today, if you look at the largest EdTech platforms in India, they are all following the intermediary requirements because they do recognize that they are an intermediary and they do want to the extent possible, avail of the safe harbors whenever it is needed.
Okay, great. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question for the panel. I think to address the concerns of the companies, the platforms, do these rules actually address the concerns or the worries or the stuff that was really bothering and inhibiting this industry from growing? I think one of the things that we, in the period from whence the interministerial task force was set up to the rules, we met all the interministerial task force members, plus Invest India, plus Niti Aayog. And the only thing we said to them was that this is a borderless industry, which is fueled by innovation. And therefore, and we being the IT power that we are, I mean, today we have only 1% market share. US has 23% market share of the online gaming industry, in China 25%. We should easily go to 5 or 10% unless we score self goals, right? Now, and what are self goals in this industry? Over-regulation, over-taxation, and of course the third thing was harassment by the state governments in every form of that. Now, do these rules actually address our concerns? Is my question.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think that's a great question, right? And often, this is one of the biggest challenges of regulation. How do you regulate without stifling innovation? Let me answer the first question first. Is this actually addressing the concerns of companies which are operating in this sector? Now, as a investor in this space, and we've seen over 1,200 plus gaming and interactive companies over the last 2 years, and we've interacted with founders. Uncertainty and ambiguity around norms and laws was a very big existential threat for these companies, right? So many of them decided to, shrug off the regulatory gaps and the regulatory lacunae and were brave to, pave the path and still build in that space. But many founders did not, deterred by this. It, to some extent, also impacts ability to raise financing. There were some investors who decided to take the plunge and said, well, regulation will eventually catch up. There were many investors who sat on the side and said, we don't want to participate until there is more regulatory clarity. So to some extent, yes, their ability to fundraise, their ability to raise capital was limited to the extent that there was no central framework, there is no nationwide policy, there was no kind of mechanism available around whether gaming, or let's say real money gaming is permissible or not. So to some extent, this does allay that concern. The third is in terms of exits, right? Even when investors do invest in companies, often the problems lie when they're trying to, and especially if it's foreign capital, the problems lies in facilitating an exit. How does an exit happen for many of these companies? And the second is then how does that capital then get repatriated back to wherever the capital, let's say, came from? And hence having any such kind of regulatory clarity is important to facilitate that. I think there was a comment made around, the fact that there is still a gap between central policy and state policy. And I think that's very correct. Like that is the first thing. And I believe that should be a very core part of recommendation, where central and state policies need to be aligned. Because if, let's say, a gaming company adheres to these norms and these policies as laid by a central government, and they adhere to and they get registered and certified by these SRB, then why does the state not then permit them to operate? And I believe that's a very legitimate concern, that if the center and the MeitY is the nodal agency for regulating this, then why should the company not be allowed to operate pan-India? And I believe that is definitely something that should be addressed in the recommendation. But great questions that have been raised.
Let me take one or two more. You had your hand raised.
Yes, yes.
Can you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name Aman Gupta and I'm from Virgil Technologies. So I just want to ask a question from the panel. In the draft rule, there is a requirement of appointment of a compliance officer, as Dhruv has also mentioned. So, and that compliance officer must be a KMP of the company, basically. So I just want to understand who can be appointed as a compliance officer and how much he would be responsible if something goes wrong, and what are the government expectations from him actually?
Does anyone?
The requirement of the compliance officer being a KMP essentially means that it has to be someone who is senior enough, right? KMP would be anyone who is heading a department, reports to the board, things like that. Excuse me. In terms of what is the expectation of that officer, I think the rules have described that as well, right? That this is the person who is to act as that point of contact when the government may have certain questions, when there may be a question of whether the platform is complying with the requirements it is meant to comply with as an OGI, etc. So the role of that officer is essentially to it's an extension of the compliance officer who may have one internally, right? That you have to ensure that this particular set of compliances under this particular framework are being followed as far as our gaming functionality and the platform that we operate is. So see, there's no personal liability, right? I think depending on what is the particular non-compliance in question, that question may vary, that degree may vary. I think this is definitely going to be a person who, for example, the government is going to get in touch with in case there are notices to be issued, or in case there are questions around compliance, or in case there's a takedown notice, for example. This is very likely to be the officer who is going to have to respond to that in a near real-time sort of a manner. It's not going to create any personal liability for this officer, but it is certainly going to create larger liability for the company or for the platform if they are not seen as complying with these requirements or not responding to a government order in time and so on and so forth.
Yes. Can someone pass them a mic? Yeah.
Hi.
And then I'll come to you.
Hi. So I think we've sort of come to maybe a conclusion with regard to some of the questions that were raised, that a central legislation would sort of solve a lot of the problems that have arisen. Say, for instance, I mean, there is a question of legislative competence as well. And there are ways we could get around that. Say there's entry 21, list 1. There's entry 42, interstate commerce. I think the High Court of Madras and Karnataka have pointed out that online gaming would constitute interstate trade and commerce. And therefore, the center would be competent to legislate on that. My question is twofold. One, the rules do sort of create some ambiguity with regard to a lot of the things that are not explained. Say, for instance, 6A says, well, we could declare any game to be an online game if there is harm to children, among other things. What is harm to children? We don't know. So in that context, of course, central legislation would be great. My question is, what are some of the things a central legislation would need to include? Say, what is the wish list that a central legislation could have with regard to regulation, a regulatory body? Say, a regulatory body maybe on the same lines as the real estate regulatory authority, which could have experts from the industry who understand gaming really well, and of course then licensing and KYC requirements. So what is the wish list essentially for a central legislation?
So you're saying that whenever the government comes up with a proper law
Right.
that is beyond these rules,
Right.
what is it that you would like it to cover? So any of the, anyone can go. Sarah, if you have any perspective from a consumer perspective, let us know about that. But sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
No, so when these rules do come out and, it's put into action, like from a gamer side, the wish list would be that, when you mention the fact that what does harm mean? What do you consider harm to a child? Basically things as simple as, making sure that when the child is playing, there is a notification that comes on their screen every 2 to 3 hours saying that, okay, you're played too much. So why don't you take a break? As simple as that, just having things put in as a reminder. So whoever is playing the game to a certain extent knows that it's very clear that what is good and what is bad, especially for kids, right? So in harm's way comes that safety of having a conversation. For example, you can have the government put out a statement saying that whenever a new conversation chat is opened up and it is towards a child, is it, and please be careful who you're talking to. This person is unknown to you. So, these are certain things that the government could put, I would say my wish list, just make sure that there's constant notification and alerts created so that kids are well informed, no matter what the game is. And that wish list will also come from the gamers. We have already spoken about this in multiple meetings, and they've always asked us that what are your top 10 things that you would require so that the government can work towards making a safe environment for gamers, and that is being addressed. I think till the 17th, 18th, a lot of people are sending in their comments on even different gaming channels where we are collecting all this feedback, and then we'll state out, say, 100 different points, and they're going to be picking out what are the 10 most important that could be put in to be very clear to even the consumer that what is good, what is bad, what is harm, and what is not harm.
I think, whenever the final law comes in, some of the elements that are here will probably translate. And I think one of the wish list elements is that children, maybe there's need for specific focus on children and what are specific measures, how do you sort of do that? And, even I think pushing, and I think there's a little bit of work that we've been doing on child harm and age gating and stuff like that in the context of broader tech in TQH. I think the focus is that you need to design platforms better to reduce harm. And some of those principles should ideally feature in any new legislation that comes up. My co-founder Prajna has been working on it, so maybe you can connect with her later. But yeah.
Just to add to the wish list, right? I think one, of course, like you said, whatever is a part of these draft rules definitely will be reflected in should be reflected rather in the new comprehensive law as and when it comes out. But one item should be that the compliance should be graded basis the level of harm that platform may potentially have to its users. It should be graded. It should not be a straight jacket formula applied to all sorts of gaming platforms. For instance, now the rules prescribe KYC to be in line with how the RBI formulates its KYC platform, its KYC regulations, right? I mean, shoehorning just that, which is usually applicable to banks, may not realistically be useful for the gaming platforms, especially the smaller ones. It can be basis the user harm that it's using it for, using it against. I think that's one of the ways that they should look at compliance for all of these platforms.
I would actually agree. We've been working on graded classification of intermediaries generally. And I think that approach, which is risk-based, should possibly, I mean, if as a moderator, I can chip in, that is going to be my wish list for this thing. Let me take, sorry, one question. She has had a hand raised for a while. Deepak, can you see if you can get a mic? Yeah.
Hi. So my question would be, I just want to understand the extent to which gaming companies host third-party content and what can we consider as them publishing their own content. And with relation to that, also whether it's in the scope of the IT Act or these rules to regulate the content of these games through these acts. So if you're regulating them as intermediaries, you can very well go ahead and do that. But then the question would be, if you're going ahead and regulating their content, is it in the scope of this of these rules, and the extent to which they publish their own content?
How I see it is right now, we are not going into content moderation other than illegality. Correct? So let's say this is betting and gambling laws, like child pornography, you can't do it, but so that's maximum there, either third party or other. Right? In terms of, you're talking about the form of the game, correct? What characters are there? What can they do? How they are depicted, correct? That content moderation, which also then also there's the issue of age rating, etc. That in India there's no standard as such. We follow other standard. So that aspect is not covered as rules, correct? Because in that sense, then you have to approach it as a publisher, and that is something I think some other ministry, most likely NID, will do. But in this case, because as the online game is defined under this, what the vision is that because it is anyway age gated for anyone above 18, right? So that graded age rating thing or content moderation thing might not be per se needed under these rules and scope. Right? So we might have to wait for the from a publisher and content moderation perspective for something else from a different maybe on this.
Your question on to what extent do these platforms own the content or the formats of the games that they're publishing? I think that's a larger question of what is the business model. And again, different platforms have a variety of ways in which they do it, largely contractual, where either they will have in-house developers or exclusive developers who will develop games for their platform, or it'll be a much more broad-based participation by developers that, someone has this game and you can play it on my platform, etc. So that's more a question of business model and what the contractual arrangement with those developers actually is. Because to the extent a platform may say that, listen, you are developing a particular format exclusively for my platform, I will own the IP, right? It really comes down to the contract of it, the commercial arrangement. And I don't think that these amendments are infringing on that, or it's not trying to dictate that or control that in any manner. I think like what Dhruv was saying is that it's not even going as far as content moderation the way we've seen for online publishers, which is under a separate chapter in the intermediary rules. What these guidelines are really doing is that they're setting out a framework of what a particular format should or should not have, and as long as it is not illegal. So I think that's really as far as what these rules are trying to establish.
Sorry, one question at the back. Sorry, at the back. Yeah. Can someone?
Yeah, hi.
Sorry. Okay, we'll come to you after that.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, I'm Manmohan from GLI. So what we have heard from your comments, SRO will play a very important pivotal role for any company who is already there or who are coming up. So the question is, how will government appoint the SRO? I can understand there would be multiple SRO, and who will be the part of the SRO, and what would be the qualification of the person who get appointed? There have been appoints that they will be 3-4 point what I saw, but how will be the SRO appointed? It would be a stipulated period, or it would be for a long period. So just wanted to have your brains on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
To your point, sir, on how does the SRO work or who are going to be a part of it? The rules talk of 5 different stakeholders who will be representing different issues, right? There's somebody from the gaming industry, somebody who will be nominated by the government, somebody who's a public policy professional. So to that extent, the intent also would be that the SRO has multi-stakeholder representation, so that whatever decisions they make in terms of registration or licensing comes from a diverse perspective. In terms of how the government will register or recognize an SRO, again, the rules talk to that effect. They say that if the SRO has a diverse set of members in it, they comply or they respond to on responsible gaming practices and do not have conflict within its board, then then the SRO could potentially be recognized by MeitY. And that's how I think it'll pan out. In terms of the duration, I think I think it's too soon to say, like I've been saying it before. The idea would be for them to be self-sustaining and be there for the industry each time somebody new comes into the space. So I don't think that the government's intention was to have them for a short duration as a stopgap arrangement, but to be a self-sustaining entity for the space.
So another question comes through that. So they are currently like SRO in the industry. So a little bit, I'm just thinking there would be new SROs also coming, or the current one would get recognized or something like that. Because as he has mentioned, that there's a lot of ambiguity on that sense that how will he get registered, a new company coming? Like, is there a framework like Rummy game has to be registered with this SRO? The pool game has to get registered, the Ludo game. I'm just talking on the air. So that's a very important point because there are other stakeholders, you know what I'm coming from in the industry besides the gaming companies also, who wants to do the business and all. So how their representation would be like taken to the government and all. So some light on that.
So I think the rules are very clear that they can be more than one SRO, correct? And MeitY has kept, so they have given, like say, what your track record is in terms of promoting responsible gaming, correct? What your track record has been generally, whether you are at arm's length distance, whether are you structuring your SRO in that it's difficult for one player to influence, correct? That MeitY will look and then recognize. So there can be more than one. It doesn't say that it can't be 3 or 4. It could be, correct? And as I said earlier, also if there's an efficient way, definitely there will be an SRO which will be more efficient than others, and everyone will start following. So that's one thing. In terms of the other stakeholders, the very idea is because it's a self-regulatory organization and there will be a lot of industry conversation before anything happens, correct? It won't be one person writing it. Everyone will have to sit and talk. And in that sense, I think the other stakeholders will also come to the conversation. They will tell, okay, fine. How do you understand? Let's say, for example, I know where you're coming from. Let's say, what is a reputed body? Correct? And I think there will be industry standards that will sort of be built up. And I think that because it is industry, it's not you have to petition to the government. Have that conversation, and I think it will get reflected into the framework, whatever that SRO creates, or whatever the industry accepts as a framework.
Let me take 2-3 more questions. There are some questions that are online as well, but some of them have already been answered through some of the other questions that people asked here. But let me go there. Yeah, to the person who raised their hand first. Yeah. Just introduce yourself and then you can ask the question. Shubham, can you check? Is that on? Sorry, or maybe we can find you another mic.
Yeah. Can I be heard otherwise?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead. So hi, my name is Keshav. I'm from the Vizi Center for Legal Policy, and I have, keeping in theme of this discussion, a multi-part question, but I'll try to keep the questions as short as possible. The first question, and I think someone mentioned this earlier, but I think there's some clarity from the panel would be good, is essentially SROs can lead to cartelization of standards, right? And the rules are not clear on how do you deal with the cartelization of standards that could become prohibitive. Now, if the answer to that is trust us, it hasn't happened, so it won't happen, that's not a good faith argument. That's not from any legal standpoint, that's not a good faith argument. So how do you deal with SROs not leading to cartelizations? Because as I say, I'm a game developer. I'm doing it in a specific field. There are 6 different SROs in this field. One has lower standards of compliance to the other. I look at the lower standards. So that it becomes the lowest common denominator to which I am setting my hygiene standards for, right? And that sounds slightly unsafe, especially from a legal standard and a legal point of view. So in this case, how do you then prevent SROs from cartelization standards and ensuring that compliance is at the highest hygiene levels and not a constant fight for the lowest common hygiene standards to ensure that individuals are protected against terrible game developers, publishers, etc. Right? The second part to this, adding to this is you mentioned, Dhruv mentioned that we follow ESRB ratings and these sort of foreign compliance standards when it comes to age gating. Given that multiple SROs could have multiple compliance issues, what stops them from changing age gating compliances? So for example, a certain SRO says, say, a shooting game must be 18 plus, while another says 13 plus is fine for this game, right? So then your age gating, because of multiple SROs, can also lead to multiple age gatings for similar published games, right? And these rules lead to fragmenting this, rather than saying we should wait for publisher rules for this. With SROs, you could have that fragmented already. So then how do you prevent age gating issues with multiple SROs fighting for this lowest common compliance standard, right? And that leads to sort of the last part of this question is, see, the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports has a yearly licensing thing for national sporting federations. That means every year an NSF has to reapply for the license saying we are following the compliance and that all our state units at the national level follows this. There is no such thing for SRO. So once you get it, it's permanent. Means, are they actually following compliance standards? Does the government have the right to ensure that these SROs are following certain minimum standards at least? And because there's no relicensing issue, how does the government sort of enforce sort of good practices amongst SROs, apart from the fact that, oh, we could de-license them at some point? That's setting a much higher standard for that de-licensing issue, rather than coming clear from the beginning what is expected from the SROs, what you have to maintain your license for, and you have to come back to the government to show that you're complying with government's rules for continuing your licenses, right? So this is sort of the three-part question I have.
Great. I think a well put question. I have some thoughts on the last one, but I'm going to defer it to the panel. Anyone wants to take that? Yeah.
So I'll take your second part of the questions first. So when we talk about age gating, just let me clarify what age gating and age rating are, correct? Age rating is the graded process of moderating content and saying, having content descriptors like ESR. Right now, it is not legally mandated for us to follow anything, but because of Google Play Store, Apple Store, etc., automatically there's something called an ARC, which follows ESRB, PEGI, etc., correct? So we don't have anything legally mandated. But when we talk about age gating, and I think these rules will only compel age gating. Age gating simply means that if you're under the age of 18, because you're playing a money game where money is involved, people only above the age of 18 can play, correct? So that's a very simple thing. One line has to be put in the framework. Anyone under the intermediaries, OGIs, should put in technical measures to ensure that anyone under the age of 18 cannot play these games. That's it. There's no common denominator there, correct? When obviously when it comes to content moderation, which is, it's not, because these rules are a part 2 of these rules. If it was under the publisher rule, then that conversation would have come. So I think that is something that the government will look into. So that's the second part. So in that sense, we are very clear. The second thing is about what will everyone run for the common denominator. And it's a fair question. It can happen, but how we are seeing it and what the conversation in the industry is, that the industry themselves went to the government saying, please regulate us, correct? And MeitY has obviously a right to sort of give directions, etc., to companies, etc. They have the right to de-recognize SROs as, correct? So what will happen is that if there are a lot of pain points for players against the SRB, they will definitely go to MeitY, and MeitY will be answerable. They also have to know that these rules are innovative, so they will have to balance that. So what I'm thinking is that the companies will act as a checks and balance against the SRB will act as a checks and balance against the company, and MeitY will act as a checks and balance against everyone. That's the hope, but as Rutuja said, let's see how it pans.
Does anyone have a different perspective? Saloni, feel free to come in whenever you want, but Shana, you can go.
Yeah, just to speak to your question on the cartelization of standards, right? I think that's a real risk. And that's also what I believe is likely to happen in the short term. It is going to lead to some sort of arbitrage across SRBs. But I think what's going to happen is that, and what the way I see it is that MeitY has left a lot to market forces and to softer checks and balances, right? They have not been prescriptive to the extent of saying that here is a methodology that every SRB has to follow. So they're not creating the uniform kind of methodology. But they have retained the ability to give notice to the SRBs, right? So it's not as though, if they believe that the SRB is not catering to a higher standard of compliance or not asking their members to comply to that, they will just automatically deregister them. MeitY does have the ability to issue instructions to the SRB as well. And what is going to happen over time is that those instructions, hopefully MeitY will make them publicly available, will serve as a body of, the minimum standards that SRBs will have to comply with over time. There's also nothing preventing METI from saying that, listen, we will issue model charter documents the way they've done for online publishers. And so we're going to see a lot of these softer measures come in place to act as checks and balances for exactly the kind of problems that you are saying. And these are problems that I would argue that a lot of markets that have, or a lot of sectors that rely on certification have. Right. And I think METI has taken a very deliberate decision that, listen, we are not going to get into this game of setting up a BIS type of an institution that is going to do this onerous licensing certification process. We are going to listen to what industry has to say right now, which has been that allow us to set up that self-regulatory mechanism, right? If it doesn't work, like Dhruv said at the beginning, I agree that METI has not been shy from amending frameworks if they believe that a existing regulatory mechanism is not working. But I think even beyond that, to the risk of, allowing members to comply at the lowest common denominator of compliance, the immediate check to that is that the law itself has a floor requirement, right, so to speak, of what are your diligence requirements. The SRBs have to ensure that the members are at least complying with that before they're even admitted as members. And then I think there's also something to be said about having that flexibility to say that, again, risk-based flexibility to say that, listen, this particular format of game perhaps does not pose the risk that, other games like Blue Whale does. And so, yes, there is a risk that we may be, there may be appetite towards catering to the lowest common denominator of compliance, but even that lowest common denominator has been set by law. You can't go below that, right? And then again, it is in that self-interest. It is in the self-interest of the SRB to show that they are, they do have that robust mechanism. They are promoting better compliance culture amongst their members and sectors. So it's going to be a lot of these softer issues that are going to act as checks and balances, and not kind of prescriptive mechanisms in the law, which we've seen METI and other departments, other ministries in the government actually actively stay away from when they're engaging in lawmaking now.
Just to add to what Shahana said, and she's right, the bare minimum can anyways be prescribed, but I think there's a lens of practicality that so any solution that you come up with is going to have issues, right? If the government were to license everything, it'll become a license raj. There'll be bottlenecks to when things get approved. There could be capture at that end as well. So the question is that what is the better of the sort of bad frameworks, maybe, so to speak. This is not necessarily bad, but that's probably the lens to see that everything is going to have some issues. The question is, can you pick one that has the least issues? Let me take one last question. Is there anybody? Yes, in the middle table. Yeah. And then after that, we can always continue the conversation over lunch.
Hi, I'm Riddhi Gupta. I am a LAMP fellow. My question is regarding these games that are hosted on e-commerce platforms. So some of them have an element of chance, others are skill-based as well. They can be quizzes of sorts. And they do have the tendency to, influence consumer behavior as well. So are those within the contemplation of these rules or IT rules in general?
Is that what you're referring to? For instance,
sorry, can you sit down? It's on.
Yeah. So could you repeat the question in terms of, give an example of what kind of
Sure.
platform you're referring to?
Yes, for example, Amazon, if you are on the app, there are these lucky draws that take place, so you can have those daily quizzes, and then you could perhaps win an iPhone. You could even trade some points that you've earned on your purchase to play these games and then earn more points or maybe enter a contest. So they can turn into addiction, and it can also, the idea is to make you hover on the app for a longer period of time. So are those games also within the contemplation of these rules or any other rules for that matter?
Sure, thanks for that. Please chip in, but I think my understanding of the definition of online games that the rules talk of is wide. It talks of anybody who can offer online game and where you put in a deposit or you've put in money to play the game. And I think you could also look at, and they talk of deposit to be in cash or in kind. So if you're looking at the kind option to be your coins, with which you can, level up in the game or have another quiz to play, then that's potentially it'll come under the regulation of what these rules prescribe. But feel free to.
Yeah, I think one of the critical elements here is that technically I'm not paying a deposit to be able to participate in that quiz. But the counter argument to that is that I would have had to make a purchase of a certain value for that quiz to become available to me, which happens on some of these e-commerce platforms. But then there are other formats which I can just go onto the platform and pay. Like even if I haven't made any purchases, those games are available for me to play, which are free to play games, right? So I think it'll come down to what exactly are the features of the game and at what point are they offered. And to what extent can I say that there is a deposit and there is a winning that I can expect after playing that game. So I think it'll come down to those sorts of facts and analysis. But it's entirely possible that some of these games that are offered, even if it is on an e-commerce platform, would be subject to these requirements. Dhruv, unless you have a...
No, I agree with Shan and Rutuja that basically the rules in very simple terms says that deposit in cash or kind and winnings in cash and kind, but winnings has to be based on the performance of the player, correct? So that's also a relevant point, that it has to be, the winnings has to be on the basis, distributed on the basis of performance of the player, correct? So, and also those games can't be purely games of chance because they will run afoul of betting and gambling laws. So that narrows the universe of games that are sort of can qualify. But again, as you said, so let's say they have a spin wheel concept, correct? But in that, you see, you just get, because you just get monthly the where you can spin. That won't, but if you get coins which are worth money, then yes.
Also, one other item I think would be the exposure, the extent of exposure to harm for that user, right? I mean, there is only so much you can play in quizzes on Amazon, as opposed to other gaming platforms where the fundamental offering is to play a game or to play quiz. So I think that will also be a part of the consideration when they see whether they should be regulated or not.
Great. With that, let's give a very big round of applause to the panel. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time. I know this has been a long-standing ask of the gaming industry, and this is a step in that direction. Obviously, there are some issues potentially that need more digging, but largely it seems to be a step in the right direction, and eventually, hopefully, we'll see more developments on the legislative front. And as MeitY is looking for feedback till the 17th, at least for now, I think I would urge everyone here to, as you're writing, keep some of these perspectives in mind that have come up here today, and hopefully it will lead to a better version of the rules that come up later. But with that, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Saloni, for joining us online. And, let's break for lunch. Thank you.